All I could do was watch and worry. It was the first time I'd directed that kind of fire, and I could only hope this was not the first time the armour had done it. I also knew that short rounds cropped up occasionally, and I gave a fleeting worried thought to the workers back in the States who had packed the shell cases. Now and then I put down my field glasses and checked the men directly, because I didn't want the magnification to make me think they were closer to the top than they actually were. When I finally gave the command to fire, the barrage was extremely intense and accurate, giving us exactly what we wanted. The Krauts could not come out in that awful blasting. They must have been terrified, strained to the limit of their nerves. Our men continued to walk rapidly up the slope, and I knew they were not getting any return fire because none of them hit the ground. My moment was almost at hand, and I watched closely through my field glasses. When they seemed to be only 100 yards from the edge of the woods, I couldn't hold out any longer, and I signalled the tanks and TDs to cease firing. The artillery FO then raised his range slightly to clear our men as they reached the edge of the woods. As they got near the bunkers, the infantry was firing from the hip. Most of the Germans were so shaken that they stayed in their shelters. They offered almost no resistance as our men moved in and captured them. Their SS commander tried to get them to fight, but was unsuccessful. I made my way quickly up the hill, and when I arrived a few minutes later, everything was completely in our hands, and our boys were jubilant. German prisoners were being led out, along with an arrogant SS officer in full dress uniform and long coat. He was mad as hell, and I only wished I could understand his German sputtering. Captain Newcomb was busy setting up our new defence, so I took over the care of the wounded, of which there were only 2. Both were given some first aid. They were then able to walk back to the aid station on their own. Remarkably enough, only a few of the Germans were wounded, a testament to the quality of their bunkers. The sides of those dugouts went down about 4 feet into the ground and stuck up another 2 feet, with the dirt from the excavation being piled against the front and on the roof. The walls were logs about 15 inches thick, and they could take anything but a direct hit. The entrance was in the back, and in front were machine gun trenches and communication trenches. Inside, the walls were lined with bunk beds, enough to accommodate 8 men comfortably, 12 in a pinch. The attack had been an absolute classic, worthy of any textbook on tactics. The advance had been almost 1,000 yards uphill across a wide-open slope, with close overhead fire support, against a strongly entrenched defender. It was my first experience in this kind of precision attack, and I'm not so sure I would have thought of the correct solution all on my own. I hated to think of the losses we might have had if a Green Company commander had had the job. I marvelled at the savvy of Captain Newcomb, and while I was as disgusted as he with his demotion, I had to admit it probably had saved a good many lives. All the gratification of this triumph was taken away by one of our discoveries. It seems that after the Germans had retaken the hill with their vicious counterattack earlier in the day, they had taken a small number of prisoners and tied them up with telephone wire, probably for safekeeping. At the outset of our tremendous shelling, the Germans had apparently rushed to their bunkers and abandoned the prisoners. It probably would have been too much to expect a German to risk his life to save a prisoner, and thus some more Americans were killed by their own shells. It was small comfort that only a few were found there. The defence was all set up for the night, and we had just finished our K-ration supper when Captain Newcomb received word from Colonel Keenan to report to battalion for a company commander's meeting. Much to my surprise and some consternation, the captain asked me to go in his place. He should have been flushed and excited from the afternoon's great achievement, but instead he was just quiet and reserved. Never before had I known him to beg off anything at all. But I didn't ask questions. The company runner and I walked back down the hill to Sellericher Höhe and battalion headquarters. The moon was bright and the countryside so serene and peaceful that we almost forgot why we were there. We turned right at the road and soon were close to the scattering of buildings that was the hamlet. Several men seemed to be loitering in front of one of the buildings, and they didn't bother to challenge us. This slackness irritated me. As I came closer, all set to bawl them out, I realized they were Krauts and quickly turned my rifle on them and yelled at them to put their hands up. They did at once, being as surprised as I. I found out later they had been on patrol. They were lost in the darkness and had been too busy talking to recognize us. We took them prisoner. Then, to further ruin my disposition, the guard at battalion headquarters only 50 yards away also failed to challenge. I grumbled to Colonel Kennan. He was pretty upset because almost anyone could have captured his headquarters. One of his staff went right out to check, and I'm sure someone caught hell. The colonel asked briefly about Captain Newcomb, and then got right down to business. The next day, February 8th, F Company was to wait until it was relieved by another company, and then swing down the northeast slope into Obermailen, now controlled by G Company. F and G then were both to attack eastward across the swollen river to the high ground beyond, while another battalion would attack abreast of us on the south side of Hill 553 and go on to take Niedermailen. Captain Newcomb, still sombre and very quiet, gave the briefest of routine instructions to the platoon leaders. He then led the forward elements in a wide semicircle to the rear and cut right around to the long, wide slope into Obermailen. Enemy artillery began to pick them up as they reached the edge of town, but most of the men found safe shelter in or behind the buildings. It was my turn with the rear elements of the company, and I pushed them ahead as rapidly as possible over the exposed hillside. The shells soon started to drop in, forcing us to take cover. After each salvo, we got up and moved quickly forward, and we always managed to stay ahead of the next volley. Suddenly the great good luck, the almost sensational good fortune that had blessed me for 8 months, abruptly left me there on the open road to Obermailen. I clearly heard the whistle of the shell and could tell by its sound that it was falling on me. I threw myself flat on the frozen ground so hard that my chin strap broke and my helmet flew off. At that, I had a little luck left, for the shell hit about 20 feet directly in front with a blast that seemed to split my head. In an instant I heard the shrapnel whipping past and also got a sledgehammer blow on my left foot. I shuddered with the impact as I lay there stunned by the concussion. The top of my snowpack had a jagged hole with blood showing, and I wondered if my toes were gone. The whole foot was numb, for which I was thankful. Everyone else seemed okay, so I yelled at the men to keep going, and to tell Captain Newcomb I had a slight wound in my foot and would call him from the aid station. Some of them looked a little surprised, but they kept on toward town as I began to limp back to the battalion aid station. I was interestedly watching the medic cut off my boot and expose the wound, when I heard Lieutenant Lee Lloyd announce over Colonel Keenan's radio that Lieutenant Wilson had been wounded and Captain Newcomb had been killed. I lay there in tears. I had no idea what the medic was doing to my foot, and I only vaguely heard the colonel fill in Lieutenant Lloyd on the attack plan. Nothing really registered with me. During my months of frontline combat, death was something that came and went. I had lost some very good friends and had had to keep going, but never had the loss been so close and personal. Arthur O. Newcomb was my best friend in the army, and I'll never forget February 8th, 1945. Captain Newcomb was by far the best company commander in combat that I ever knew, though he really didn't look the part. He was short and of slight build, with a sober, unprepossessing personality, but with a quick, dry wit and an exceptionally sharp mind. He took everything in stride, thinking ahead all the time and never giving way to panic. His men and officers grew to love him because, for one thing, they knew that if anyone ever could get them through, it would be Captain Newcomb. Lieutenant Colonel Keenan, who was also terribly unsettled by the tragedy, later observed that Captain Newcomb was of that rare breed that can act and can inspire others to act courageously on a battlefield. He was an exceptionally able, brave, and gallant soldier. It was difficult to imagine any harm coming to him. He was, I believe, an ROTC officer, and he used to talk a lot about the good times he'd had at the University of Wyoming and in the West. He also mentioned quite a bit about his family and their sheep ranch in the hills. Some time later, friends at F Company told me that shelling forced them to take cover in buildings as soon as they had reached Obermailen. Captain Newcomb had been entering a building when a shell hit the doorway. A battle-wise veteran, Captain Newcomb should have taken any cover available, yet witnesses said he had made no effort to protect himself. The 22nd Infantry Regiment went on a few days later to take the important rail centre of Prum, the main mission of that campaign, but of this I am not able to give a first-hand account. As I sat flat on the floor of the battalion aid station, my mind was on Captain Newcomb, and I was only dimly conscious of the medic sprinkling sulphur powder on my foot and dressing it. I returned to reality when a jeep took me to the rear battalion aid station, although I was still deep in shock. A medical technician used some surgical forceps to remove the piece of shrapnel from my big toe, telling me that the toe was broken and that I'd be going back for a nice long rest. At the next stop down the line, Regimental Aid Station, a doctor looked at my foot and decided to leave it alone. He ordered a medic to put a tag on me with a brief description of the wound. A short time later, I was loaded into an ambulance with 3 other wounded men. Then the driver headed for the field hospital 50 miles farther back. The trip was very bumpy over torn-up roads. The medic riding with us had to spend the entire time sitting or kneeling beside a casualty in an attempt to keep plasma flowing into him. He was typical of all the medics I saw. They did their best willingly and unhesitatingly. We infantrymen knew that if we got hit, a medic would run out and drag us back in, if at all possible. They were so dedicated, it seemed they simply ignored bullets. Actually, they were just as scared as we were. It was almost dark when we reached the field hospital, and our stretchers were lined up on the floor of a large receiving room that must have been a gym. The place was unheated, and someone threw a blanket over each of us. Medics walked up and down the lines of stretchers, weeding out the most urgent surgery cases, and my turn came after about a 2-hour wait. As I looked out across the gym at row after row of stretchers, the scene reminded me of one in Gone with the Wind. It is always the infantryman who suffers worst in war. I was stripped of all my clothes and personal belongings by an orderly. Nothing was ever returned. Perhaps it was a bit of poetic justice. The most valuable object I had was a gold watch with a diamond marking each hour. I had taken it from a 50-year-old German who had been sent to the German infantry as a replacement when we first attacked the Siegfried Line in September 1944. He had formerly been stationed as an interpreter in Paris, where he had taken it from a shop. Though offered as much as $300 for the watch, I had decided to keep it. I wonder if the orderly ever got home with it. I also lost a very good Luger pistol. Surgery was a small room with a few gas lanterns and the usual table. The young surgeon who worked alone there looked extremely tired. He gave me a local and quickly began to clean out the wound. Then he began to cut along each side of my toe to get at the ends of the severed tendon and tie them together. He told me there was nothing he could do about the bone, which was cut almost through. I tried to sit up to watch him in action, but he firmly pushed me back and said, "Sorry, but you can help me more lying down." He finished tying the tendon, sewed up the wound, and then taped a protective wire cage over the foot. Early next morning, we were moved by train to a nice, large hospital not far from Paris. There, my wire cage was replaced by a walking cast. We stayed about 2 days and then were put on a train to Cherbourg, where we were loaded on a hospital ship for the crossing to England. While on the English Channel headed for Plymouth, England, my stomach got very upset, and I vomited. At first, the doctors thought I had the usual seasickness, but when it persisted after my arrival at the 101st General Hospital near Bristol, the doctors became quite interested. 3 were assigned to work on my problem. After experimenting for 3 or 4 days with the usual tests and remedies for stomach ailments, with no cooperation at all from the patient's stomach, they gave it all up and decided to start from scratch. They went into my medical history right back to childhood, particularly about digestive problems, of which I had had none. Then they came up to the recent past and asked about my eating habits in the army. They probed and found out I had been almost entirely on K rations since June 1944. That they couldn't believe. So I explained that I'd been on the front continuously for 8 months, and that we received normal food from our kitchen trucks only when it was safe to bring them close to the front. That had not happened very often. I said it was a safe bet that about 90% of my total meals had been Ks, and that there were stretches of several weeks at a time when we never saw our kitchens. The doctors explained that they had had a great many combat veterans come through, but never anyone who had been in combat so long. I felt they were being polite, that they really didn't believe me, so I told them to check my records. They finally took my word for it and decided the long siege on K rations had gradually changed my stomach so much that it couldn't readjust to regular food. Then they put me on pap, and my digestion cleared up right away, though not my disposition. I was starving and they wouldn't help me. The other men in the ward got deliciously loaded trays, and all I received was a little dab somewhere in the centre of my plate. After about a month they relented and put me on a regular diet. I never thought hospital food could taste so great. While my toe wound was legitimate enough, about 20 other men were in the ward, and everyone was in worse shape than I, which made me feel somewhat out of place. A couple of them had been riding in jeeps that were blown up by mines, and their bodies had been shattered. Worst of all was a soldier who had 19 fractures in his arms and legs. He was strung up in traction with several pins through each leg. His condition was so bad the doctors couldn't even move him into the operating room for the setting of still more fractures, so a team of doctors and nurses worked on him in the ward. I watched in fascination as they knocked him out with a shot and then used a bone drill and put more pins in his legs. We could hear the bones grate as they were being set. That night this poor fellow, who never complained, had a bad dream. He screamed and thrashed around in the bed and yelled at his men as he fought a battle all over again. I rang for a nurse, who was elsewhere, and then hobbled over to his bed and tried to rouse him out of the nightmare by talking to him and very gingerly shaking him. He didn't respond, so I slapped his face quite gently, which brought him around. I hated to do that, but the nurse later told me he was probably doing himself a lot of damage tossing around. The doctors worked on him for several more hours the following day, then kept him under heavy sedation for the next few days. After the war, I met our ward nurse near home, much to our mutual surprise. She told me the poor fellow was in her ward for over a year, but finally did recover. About a week after my cast was removed, I was transferred to a rehabilitation hospital near Barnstable. There we went through a program of exercise, some pretty darn severe, but it did have the salutary effect of getting us back in shape. For recreation, we played volleyball and ping-pong, and after a while we were given passes to Birmingham, 18 miles away. While there, I also managed a short orientation course under the exchange program at Birmingham University, and I even wound up living in a very posh private boys' school adjacent to the university. There, despite the war, everything was most formal. As part of the course, we also visited some public schools, a government slaughterhouse, and the city's water system. This last was a major problem, because the water for that city of over 2 million came over open viaducts from rivers in the hills 75 miles away. The Germans had sabotaged the system for a while, and the people suffered shortages. Water had to be trucked in. Most interesting of all was our trip to the very old city of Coventry, the site of the immortal King Arthur and his legendary Round Table. Less than 100 yards from the King Arthur collection was a church dating back to AD 500 that had been hit by German bombs. About 75% of the church was in ruins, but the local people had pledged to rebuild it. In mid-April, I must have been in a most peculiar state of mind, because I actually passed up a chance for a brief vacation in Ireland. It seemed I was silly enough to want to get back to the 22nd Infantry before the war ended. Soon I found myself in a replacement centre, Repel depots, we called them, near Birmingham. Because my records showed I'd been a company commander in combat, I was given command of a company of 200 black troops and was told to get them equipped and delivered to France. For a staff, I had 5 white officers and 1 black, and I should mention that at this time in history there was no such thing in the army as integration. All the officers had been wounded and were returning to duty. Of the 200 enlisted men, only 3 had been wounded in battle. The rest were mostly VD casualties. It was something of an adventure to keep the men equipped. What was issued one day might be gone the next. Every day thefts were reported to me. Some of the men sold, traded, or gave away their personal equipment. I soon learned that some of the local English women were available for cash or goods. Most of the men had had very little schooling, and their ringleaders, most of whom had decent educations, seemed devoted to keeping them stirred up. The black first sergeant was very good, however, and he soon had the ringleaders picked out. Our job then was to try to keep them so busy they didn't have time to bother anyone. Nonetheless, I did have to break up one knife fight, and I also had to stop dice games, which usually led to combat, though not the kind we were in Europe to fight. At last, we were ordered to stand final inspection before embarkation, and some of these actors went all out to louse up the inspection and delay returning to their units. One character even lipped off to the inspecting major when ordered to turn in his personal luggage to the sergeant for shipment home. This black soldier, a really huge man, deliberately addressed the major as captain and told him he'd have to come and get the luggage himself if he wanted it so damned bad. Without an instant's hesitation, the major jerked the luggage from the man's hand and tossed it to the sergeant. The big soldier just sulked as his cardboard suitcase was taken away. Later, the major confided to me that he thought the soldier wanted to be thrown into the brig, and that the best punishment for such men was to return them to the front. Next, the doctors lined the men up for short-arm inspection, and of course that also had its antics. Some of them still had VD, and when these souls were pulled off the list for shipment out, they laughed and clapped their hands with glee, and sometimes did a little jig. A few days later, our group did indeed reach Le Havre, France. To my immense personal relief, the unit was broken up, and the men were shipped out to their own units, mostly service or truck companies. My stint as their commander had lasted only 10 days, and I very much doubted I could have coped much longer. Keeping the men in the proper equipment was a constant worry. Lack of cooperation can be immensely more frustrating than some days of actual combat. I was immediately assigned to a replacement pool. Next day we began a series of moves back to our outfits. If this had been the time of the bulge, we could have been shot back to the front by express, but now we had no great priority, and the army seemed in no hurry to return us to our units. Our first stop was a French military base behind the Maginot Line, and we stayed there for 3 or 4 days in nice brick officers' quarters, much like the permanent buildings on the main post at Fort Benning, Georgia. One day we toured the Maginot, entering this massive underground defensive line through huge doors in the rear. The French captain guiding us admitted that the Germans had taken that sector of the impregnable line simply by going through a gap and approaching from the rear, which was not defended. The fortifications of the Maginot Line were 4 stories of concrete, with 2 stories below ground, and with the excavated dirt being piled on the sides and on top, so that it looked like a long, low ridge. There were apertures for small arms fire, for machine guns, and for cannon. Large gun turrets facing the front were retractable and had periscope sights, so the crew could operate entirely behind the cement walls. What amazed me, though, was that the largest guns behind all these elaborate, expensive turrets were only the old 75 AS of World War I. Other features that impressed me were the conveyor systems for feeding ammunition to the guns, the comfortable living quarters for the crew, and larders with enough supplies to withstand any sort of siege for at least 3 months. Overall, it was a tremendous engineering feat, of which the natives still seemed quite proud. It was an even more outstanding example of military futility. The old French generals had still been planning on static trench warfare. Even if they'd been able to stop the Germans from breaking through a gap, it would have been easy for the Germans to drop paratroops and take the undefended rear. And yet the Germans, the inventors of the modern warfare that obsoleted the Maginot, themselves built a Siegfried Wall, which we were able to break through in only 1 day. In addition to touring the Maginot, we were also allowed to visit a nearby town of some 500 folks. One thing that should be said about France, and probably much of the continent, is that they openly accept as matter of fact and part of normal life some institutions that more straight-laced nations endure, if at all, more discreetly. Thus, the local sin emporium was flourishing, in no small way supported by army personnel, and the base commander recognized it to the extent of sending in army doctors to examine the girls. Then all of a sudden some higher army commander ordered those spas closed at once, and it became the job of the current guard, led by me, to execute the orders and evict the madam and about 20 girls. Our orders did not require us to follow through, however, so the girls were soon out on the streets enterprising. Finally, after so many long, bleak years for the natives and pain and suffering for all of us, victory in Europe, VE Day, arrived, May 8, 1945. The population exploded into the streets and danced and drank the night away amid fireworks and everything else they could cut loose with. Some of us got a little homesick. All of us celebrated on this happy occasion. The balance of our trip to Nuremberg was interminable, slow and unpleasant, for we no longer rated anything but the infamous 40 and 8 boxcars, 40 men or 8 horses, and I wouldn't treat a horse that way. Occasionally we were sidetracked for supply trains headed east into Germany, and for long trainloads of pitiful Frenchmen who had been slave labour for 4 years and who were headed home to France. Their faces were thin, and their eyes were set in deep, dark sockets. They were jammed in worse than we, with barely enough room to stand. Though dirty and helpless, they still were going in the right direction, and they waved in wild excitement as their boxcars crawled past. I couldn't help thinking of the awful shock some of them might be facing. Houses in ruins, wives who had fraternized, children fathered by the enemy, no money, no jobs, no prospects, and nothing but the shakiest government. Nuremberg, which we went through on trucks, was my first view of a major city bombed by the Allies. Besides being an important railhead, it was also a highly emotional target as the sacrosanct heartland of the Nazi cult, the wellspring of Hitlermania, the breeding ground of the Third Reich plague. British and American bombers had attacked day and night, hitting it with everything from incendiaries to blockbusters. Fires had raged out of control, and we heard that casualties on one night's raid reached 75,000. Blocks and blocks were level acres of rubble. Now and then we would see a building with some outer walls gone, the inner floors still suspended in mid-air with furniture, rugs and bedding standing intact, looking like a huge dollhouse. The old walled inner city was completely demolished. Nothing was standing, nothing moved. It was all broken bricks and dust. The rail yards were a mess of shattered boxcars, steam engines and roundhouses. Heavy rails were bent like wires, some being twisted into giant corkscrew spirals 30 or 40 feet in the air. Wooden ties were splintered or burned, and even the heavy steel supports under boxcars were melted so they sagged to the ground. At one point we passed the massive, deserted stadium Hitler had built for his mass rallies, and I remembered the newsreel shots of the sea of rabid, uniformed, chanting disciples responding to his posturing and ranting. Our trucks continued out of town toward Bamberg, present home of the 4th Division, and I couldn't get used to the sight of former German soldiers still in uniform, for that's all they had to wear, straggling homeward. They were walking. Even the few who had bicycles just walked beside them, as though afraid to ride on the highways with all the American trucks. They didn't eye us directly, and their appearance was most ragged and dejected. Nevertheless, I had the feeling they were deeply relieved that it was all over. The other civilians we happened to see were mostly women, and their expressions were uniformly stiff and unsmiling. In addition to the usual fear of conquering invaders, still an unknown quantity, they must have had their worries about whether any of the stragglers would turn out to be sons or husbands. I reached Bamberg, headquarters of the 4th Division, about May 10th, and soon I was in a jeep headed for Rothenburg and the 22nd Infantry Regiment. Colonel Ruggles, our new regimental commander, greeted me warmly and told me Colonel Buck Lanham had been promoted to Brigadier General and transferred. We had a pleasant chat about all the changes in the 22nd and in my 2nd Battalion during my absence. Then I asked if he knew what had happened to my promised promotion to captain. He told me that all promotions for the 2nd Battalion had been scrapped. I gathered that for some reason Colonel Lanham had gotten mad at the entire 2nd Battalion, had discarded the suggested promotions, and had even replaced Lieutenant Colonel Kennan. I was never able to learn why. I told Colonel Ruggles that it didn't seem fair to penalise those who had earned and deserved promotions, and I asked him to recommend me for a captaincy based on his personal knowledge of my record. This may seem pretty pushy, but I knew I deserved a captaincy, and was gradually learning to speak up for myself. Without hesitation, Colonel Ruggles said he would be happy to put my name on the list, but that he couldn't promise anything now that the war in Europe was over. As it turned out, the army had frozen all promotions. He tried again once he reached the States, but that too was denied, so I remained a first lieutenant. A jeep now took me to Dinkelsbühl, headquarters of 2nd Battalion, where I reported to our new commanding officer, Major Clifford Swede Henley. I had heard of the big Swede and had seen him a time or two, but never had met him. His welcome was warm and pleasant, and he introduced me to several of the new officers. I also shook hands with some of the veterans, including Captain George Kerr and Captain McLean. Major Henley was extremely decent to me, and I could tell by his somewhat uncomfortable manner that he was most reluctant to have to tell me he had no company commander positions left in the battalion, that the best he could do was offer me a job as company exec. What I replied, in effect, was, "From all I can see, sir, my experience alone makes me senior to almost any company commander in this battalion. I want a company here or in another battalion. If you really can't make enough changes to give me a company, then I'll go back to Colonel Ruggles and ask for a transfer." I can't imagine myself having said anything remotely like that a few short months earlier, and it's a wonder he didn't throw me out. Instead, he just said, "Well, give me a couple of days to see what I can do. Hang around battalion headquarters and maybe we can work things out." So I was given a room in the small hotel that served as battalion headquarters, and a few days later Major Henley sent for me and asked if I would agree to take command of H Company. That's about the way he phrased it. I told him a heavy weapons company, water-cooled machine guns and 80mm mortars, would be new to me, but I was sure I could handle the job. So it was arranged. Charles Pillard, H Company's commander, went to battalion headquarters as an assistant S3, and I became commander of H Company. In H Company's area of operations was a German military hospital filled with wounded German soldiers, and this had to be guarded. I assigned Sergeant Flipowitz and 2 squads of men to the job. They had no trouble at all keeping things under control. Also nearby, though not my company's responsibility, was a large prisoner-of-war stockade filled with German soldiers. As might be imagined, German officers and non-coms kept the strictest discipline within the stockade. These Germans were still official prisoners, and it must have been odd to them to see former comrades in arms, who had lain down their arms at the end of the fighting, walking about freely on the outside as they straggled homeward. As a matter of fact, there was some irony in this, for we American conquerors were still indentured to the military, while our vanquished paraded around as instant civilians. Of course, we had another war going on halfway around the world in the Pacific, and some of us worried that MacArthur might be aware of the fine combat record of the 4th Infantry Division. He was, we learned later. Another thing we kept a wary eye on was an old camp for a few hundred displaced persons just released from slave labour. These poor people had existed in long Quonset huts, where they were packed in like animals, being forced to sleep on the floor in rows. They had been imprisoned in filth, and the first steps in their emancipation were hot showers and delousing, a clean set of clothes, and burning of the old rags. After a few days, they were sent on their way home, which for most was in the Balkans. As for our relations with local civilians, there weren't supposed to be any. The army had set up a strict ban against what it called fraternization, which was emphasized with a 9 p.m. curfew. That seemed the safest rule, considering the number of irrepressible mischief-makers among our ranks and the newness of the peace. One of my men soon proved the value of the rule. He finagled a jeep and driver from the motor pool after the curfew, and with the generous help of a Lithuanian refugee, located a friendly place where he could load up on local moonshine. After a while, delightfully drunk, the man pushed the driver into the passenger seat and took over the wheel. Soon he had up enough speed on the gravel road to miss a turn, totally wreck the jeep, send the driver to the hospital with a back injury, and kill the refugee. Apparently totally relaxed, the cause of it all walked away with a few bumps and bruises. His luck didn't end there either, for the battalion commander let him off with a severe reprimand, and even classified the jeep as our final combat loss to make it expendable. A few weeks later, and the fellow would have had to pay for the jeep. Given army pay in 1945, that might have stretched out a while. Another disturbance in our routine was the arrival of some replacements directly from the States. The group had been lucky enough to hit the end of the war, but one of their number at once ran into combat with our first sergeant. The veteran top sergeant, a virtuoso in the art of chewing out GIs, had been getting a little out of practice due to our humdrum duties, and he pounced lovingly on one of the new men. This unfortunate had been a saltwater corporal, one appointed unofficially and very temporarily for the duration of the journey. He had decided unilaterally to keep the rank and sew on real corporal's stripes. He also had some whoppers on his service record, and when this form finally reached the first sergeant, there was something of a verbal explosion. After the sergeant had run out of words, he scratched a 6-foot by 6-foot square on the ground, presented the new private with a pick and shovel, and had him dig down 6 feet. Many, many hours later, when the excavation was completed, the sergeant was quite pleased with it, and as a reward he let the man fill it up again. As for living quarters, we were practically in garrison. One big school building housed the whole company. Our only continuing problem was the electricity, for we never knew whether we were plugging into AC or DC, 110 volts or 220. Several of our people blew up radios before we figured out the system. The geography there was reminiscent of Michigan farmland, with its rolling hills, wide fields, and patches of woods. Another link to home was the type of storage bins in common use, which were very similar to what we called fruit cellars when I was a boy in Michigan. Mounds of earth lined with straw to hold potatoes, carrots, turnips, cabbage, etc. The vegetables kept well all winter and could be dug up as needed. Peacetime duty in Dinklespool was most pleasant. Our most serious overall business was recreation. Some of us became pretty good at pitching horseshoes. At first, we were handicapped by having to use what was available, and this meant the huge old iron shoes of local farm horses. After a while, we acquired the regulation shoes used in competition, and soon were holding tournaments. Although we had to be mindful of fraternizing, we didn't think this applied to the local trout. Some of us picked up some of the best trout fishing ever in the small river that ran right through town. The Burgermeister managed to come up with old cane poles, lines, and a few hooks. We then dug up some worms and headed for a bend in the river about a mile out of town, where he had suggested the fishing was exceptionally good. Lee Lloyd and our driver went along, and after about 3 hours we came back with almost 100 nice 10 to 15-inch trout for the cooks. This simple, pastoral life couldn't go on forever, and in June 1945 we entrucked for the first leg of our move home. Soon we bivouacked near Firth. Our entire company stayed in tents on the edge of a big hayfield, and without much else to do, we watched interestedly as the German farmer, his robust wife, and his strong-armed daughter cut the entire field by hand using cradle scythes. Then they used huge rakes with wooden tines to get the hay in rows to dry. The farmer in me noticed the hay had to be turned a couple of times in the next few days. When the hay was finally dry, they loaded it onto a wagon drawn by a big draft horse and a milk cow hooked up side by side. The farmer stayed on the wagon, and the 2 women pitched all the hay up to him. It was a crude, old-fashioned way of farming, but it worked. I supposed that Hitler could not spare the metal for farm machinery, and that many of the workhorses had become military casualties. After a few more restless weeks, with plenty of horseshoe pitching, we were happy to board the trucks again for the final overland leg, as we followed the Autobahn to Metz, and then travelled clear across the rest of France to reach the English Channel at Le Havre. Our ships were not yet in the harbour, and this meant a few more days to kill in a tent camp nearby. Practically all my time went into tedious paperwork, for customs required a declaration to be made out for each non-military item a man wanted to bring home, and the company commander had to examine every piece of paper and then sign it. Later, when we reached the States, the customs people didn't look at a single thing, and all that paperwork had been for nothing. Finally, on July 3rd, we boarded the famous Liberty ship, the USAT Excelsior, and sailed for the good old USA. For several days the seas were high, and the ship pitched and rolled and vibrated severely when the stern came up and the propeller was out of the water. Our speed was cut to about 5 knots, and we didn't think we'd ever get out of the Atlantic. I didn't feel too well most of the time, and once I was knocked flat on the deck by a sudden pitch. Many of the men were very seasick and spent most of their time below deck and away from the mess hall. Then, 10 days out of Le Havre, we landed at Hampton Roads, Virginia, along with M Company, while the rest of the regiment was landing in New York. We were given 30 days off, but that wasn't too much for all the things on my schedule. From Le Havre, I had written Florine, my bride-to-be, that she should go ahead with the wedding arrangements. I estimated my arrival home at about July 15th. As it happened, I missed it by 2 hours, arriving home in Grand Ledge, Michigan, at 2 a.m. on July 16th. No one was at the station to meet me. I had wired, but they never received the message. So I phoned from the station in Lansing, and that brought everyone to attention. Soon they all arrived to drive me the last 12 miles home. I had been gone 15 months, over half of it in combat, and there is no describing the delicious feeling of being home again. The feeling doesn't last long, and it has to be earned, but during its fleeting moments it is absolute bliss. I couldn't believe it. I was home. On July 21st we had a nice church wedding and a big reception, which was what Florine wanted. My dad loaned me his 1937 Hudson Terraplane, and a friend at a Shell station got me some gas coupons for the short honeymoon trip to Grand Rapids and Half Moon Lake near Stanton. We rented a lakefront cottage, and our honeymoon was beautiful. News of the first atomic bomb dropped on Japan came while I was still on leave, and a few days later came the tremendous news of Japan's complete surrender. At that moment I happened to be in Grand Ledge, and I could not control, nor was I ashamed of the tears that suddenly flooded my face. I now was a married man, and the 4th Division would not, as rumours had insisted, be part of the invasion of Japan. I was flooded with relief. Just as I was beginning to adjust to the incredibly pleasant civilian life, my 30 days' leave ran out, and I had to report back to the 4th Division, now at Camp Buckner, outside Durham, North Carolina. Florine soon joined me, and we came upon a small 2-room apartment in Durham for $1.40 a month. It had a kitchen equipped with a kerosene stove, a portable tin oven, and an icebox. I also picked up a 1942 Hudson and shared rides with other officers back and forth. The peacetime army wasn't too bad at that point. We managed to keep ourselves occupied with much routine and a half-hearted training schedule. I couldn't help but notice that some of the men marching out to remote training areas seemed to have extra bulges inside their shirts, and that some of their rifles looked an awful lot like softball bats. Finally, the army faced the inevitable and set up a system of priorities for releasing its guests. They awarded points for time in service, with extra points for overseas duty, and 5 points for each major campaign and every medal. I was one of the lucky ones to get an early release, rolling up over 100 points with my 3 years' service, 15 months overseas, 5 major campaigns, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and 1 Silver Star. On September 30th, 1945, one day after my 24th birthday, I became a full-time civilian. 3 years and 11 days had passed since my first encounter with the United States Army. Jobs were scarce, and many people were out of work now that war production was over. I could have returned to my old job on the railroad, but I just didn't want to. I was a different person. I found I liked to deal with people face to face, person to person, and it seemed the best place for that was in sales. I started off with vacuum sweepers, which I sold fairly easily until the company went on strike. I went into other lines until I wound up in insurance. There seems to be further irony in my life in the fact that I, who as a young man saw so much death and destruction that carried with it no compensation whatsoever, except perhaps the honour of having fought with courage and distinction, should go into a business that attempts to put a price on a loss. Out of all this damned useless war, I hope I am entitled to a few simple observations. The cost in grief and devastation, if it's on the scene, is so immeasurably expensive that no one really wins. No human being disputes this fact of life. So why can't human beings think of this before a war? If war there must be, then above all it must be kept away from our shores. If I and all of my fellows learned one thing, it was that keeping war at arm's length may not be possible with modern long-range weapons, and so there must be no war in the first place. Such prevention seems possible, with human beings, only if there is strength overwhelming enough and obvious enough that no one would dare take the first step toward war. The war we fought in Europe was uneven enough when calculated in terms of puny men in the face of incredible firepower and colossal war equipment, unfair enough when seen in terms of the futility of strategy in the face of brute strength. It was surely the last war in which strategy could still be employed and make a difference in outcome. Nuclear weapons are bound to render this time-honored convention of war null and void. One of the most visible religious leaders of the world, the Pope, stood at the memorial to the dead at Hiroshima and proclaimed that mankind must take a step forward in wisdom and emotional maturity so that this sort of catastrophe will never happen again. I hope we are up to it. Let there be peace.